The Assam Rifles doesn't have a very flourishing history. There are documented evidence of the Assam Rifles, conducting extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses.
Hello, and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. Today, Thursday, May 22, we're talking with Angshuman Choudhury from the National University of Singapore about India's Assam Rifles killing 10 members of the Tamu People's Defence Team on the India-Myanmar border. And we'll talk about the border area between Myanmar, Bangladesh and India more generally. But before Angshuman comes on, today, which is episode 28, we'll first cover the recent industrial relations actions in Yangon. With all the conflict across the country, for example, the Kachin Independence Army shot down a military helicopter in Bamor this week, plus the earthquake, over 500,000 people are still urgently needing food assistance as a result of the quake, according to the UN. With all that, it's been a while since news has come out of the industrial estates in Yangon. In fact, we haven't talked about it since last November. But if you've been reading Frontier's daily briefings and media monitoring, then you'll know that a massive strike has been taking place at the Tsang Yi Shoe mega factory in Hlaingtharya West Township, starting May 14. Around 6,000 workers downed their tools at the huge complex, demanding improved conditions, including higher daily wages, attendance bonuses, and overtime pay. Now, the factory is owned by a Taiwanese businessperson. It's one of 5 factories in Myanmar where workers manufacture shoes for Adidas, which is quite a well-known global brand. During the strike, the factory was visited by military soldiers, police, and the SAC's Deputy Labour Minister, Win Shane. But there was no violence or intimidation reported. Then on Tuesday this week, workers and management agreed to terms, including an improvement in workers' total daily income to 12,000 kyat per day. Now that's barely $3, but it's still an improvement. And it's nearly double the mandated minimum wage plus allowances. These strikes were notable, not only for their massive scale, but also for resolving in the workers' favour. The agreement could set a precedent for labour conditions in other factories in Myanmar's economically important garment sector. One worker interviewed claimed that other nearby factories, however, already had better conditions than Tsang Yi, which was lagging behind. So, if you want to hear more about labour conditions in general and union organising since the 2021 coup, you can have a listen back to my conversation with Go Maung in episode 4 of this podcast. That was on November 22. Now on to the main story of the week. So this news relates to Tamu district, which is an area of mixed control in northwest Sagaing region on the Indian border. Many of the urban wards, urban parts of Tamu town are controlled by the military, but other parts are controlled by resistance forces. So the Assam Rifles killed 10 members of the Tamu District People's Defence Team on May 14 and then returned their bodies a few days later. They were buried on Friday in an area controlled by People's Defence Forces. The Indian Army's Eastern Command claimed that the killings were the result of a firefight and that weapons were confiscated from the dead. However, photos of the bodies appear to show evidence of torture. And members of the Tamu People's Defence Team that spoke to media outlet Myanmar Now say that the 10 people were abducted and killed in cold blood. The Alternative National Unity Government, the NUG, released a statement yesterday saying that it, and I quote, observed that the circumstances of the incident differed significantly from narratives circulated in some Indian media outlets, end quote. The NUG also claimed that evidence suggested the 10 members were not killed in a firefight and requested that the Government of India clarify the facts, ensure accountability, provide compensation, and suspend any fencing operations on the border. So to try and better understand just what happened here, we're joined now by Angshuman Choudhury. doctoral candidate in Comparative Asian Studies, jointly at the National University of Singapore and King's College London. And he's also a long-time watcher of India-Myanmar affairs and a native of northeast India. Angshuman Choudhury, welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Frontier Myanmar members are obviously familiar with Chin State and Sagaing region, and on this podcast we often talk about political and armed groups in those areas, but listeners might be a little bit less familiar with the politics, the insurgencies in northeast India over the border. Over there, there's also a dizzying array of armed groups. And these killings took place near the borders of India's Manipur state, Chin State, and Sagaing region. But they were carried out by the Assam Rifles. So let's just start there. Who are the Assam Rifles?
Yeah, so the Assam Rifles is a paramilitary force in India. It's, in fact, the oldest paramilitary force in India, which dates back to the British colonial period. And it's a bit of a unique force because it's jointly administered by the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. So administratively, it's managed or supervised by the Ministry of Home Affairs, but the deputations, the senior officer deputations, are made by the Indian Army. So it's in that way, it's a distinct force which combines two different arms of the government. And I think about 90% of the deputations are made from the Indian Army, and the rest of it is made from a separate cadre of the Assam Rifles. It has a very unique mandate, which is a joint mandate of border control, border management, and border security, and at the same time conducting counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations along the border. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Now, you mentioned the border quite a bit there. So making it clear, the Assam Rifles don't just operate in Assam, which is far west from the Myanmar border.
Yeah. And
where the killings occurred.
Yeah.
So that title's not a territorial designation.
Exactly. And just a broader sort of operational mandate that the Assam Rifles has is that it's tasked with policing the entire India-Myanmar land border, which is about 1,640 kilometers long. So it is the primary frontline force to kind of police and defend the India-Myanmar border. But this particular incident happened during which there was a joint operation between the Assam Rifles and the Indian Army's Spear Corps, which comes under the Eastern Command of the Indian Army. So usually it's the Assam Rifles conducting counterinsurgency operations along the border, but in cases of high voltage or high intensity operations, they're usually conducted in conjunction with the Indian Army.
And are the Assam Rifles popular, or are they feared in India?
Well, the Assam Rifles as a history doesn't have a very flourishing history in the Northeast. It has there are documented evidence of the Assam Rifles conducting extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses. In fact, the most famous case was in 2004 when the Assam Rifles was accused by the people in Manipur of picking up one activist known as Manorama and murdering her and dumping her body in Manipur near Imphal. And I think what that triggered was this massive protest and this really unique form of protest, which then became iconic, where a bunch of Manipuri Meitei women staged a naked protest in front of Kangla Fort, which was the headquarters of the Assam Rifles at the time. And they held up a poster which said, "Rape us, Indian Army," because there were charges that Manorama was raped by Assam Rifles personnel before being murdered and dumped. And that photograph became quite iconic. So that incident became the metaphor for a larger sort of anxiety and angst against the Assam Rifles and how it treated locals in the Northeast. I think since then, over the last few years, over the last decade, I think Assam Rifles had managed to somewhat cleanse their image, but on and off, these incidents keep turning up. These ugly incidents keep turning up. In 2021, for example, the Assam Rifles was accused of extrajudicial killing and of murdering another man in Manipur, and the investigation did not probably reach a logical conclusion. So yes, it doesn't really have a very comfortable history, as far as it has a complicated relationship between the people of the Northeast and the force itself.
All right, that's great information. Super helpful. Now, we don't know much about these killings, but we do know the Assam Rifles took responsibility for them. Now, there was some quick reporting by an Indian journalist, Rajiv Bhattacharya. He came up with a few different theories of what happened. The first is that the Tamu People's Defence Team didn't agree to some kind of new demands by the Assam Rifles. I mean, they could have been about the border fencing or something else. Then they were kidnapped then, tricked, tortured, and killed. The second theory is that the killings were orchestrated by an Assam Rifles officer with a kind of personal or community-related grudge against that defence team. And then the third theory is that it was a case of mistaken identity entirely. The Assam Rifles thought that the People's Defence Team members belonged to a different group entirely. Now, that seems like the least likely one, but are any of these theories plausible?
Yeah, it's actually impossible to know what exactly happened on the ground because the area is very remote and allegedly there were no eyewitnesses to the incident. And even if there were, because we're talking about an elite force being involved and the Indian Army being involved, eyewitnesses are unlikely to come forward and give testimonies for fear of the security and life, whatever. Um, but my best guess is there was some extraordinarily kind of unusual amount of misunderstanding and a rare kind of misunderstanding that led to this incident because um, shooting dead and killing 10 cadres of a particular armed group is it's a rare incident even by standards of counterinsurgency in that area. So there was some kind of grave misunderstanding on what is the exact nature of the misunderstanding. I hope it comes out in subsequent investigations, but it is like because what we know is that there is undergoing endeavor to sort of fence that particular border at the moment, and the Assam Rifles has been offering protection to the fencing party or the construction party, and fencing that border has always been a thorny issue because of territorial differences and misunderstandings of where exactly the border lies, because large parts of the border are they may be demarcated but they're not fenced. So it is likely that there was some dispute over the border because if we go by the NUG statement, which was released last evening, there seems to be some misunderstanding over the border fencing. And one of the demands that the NUG has made to the Indian side is to temporarily suspend border fencing. So it is likely that something to that effect happened. And as you said, there are some theories floating around, including a personal angst that one of the officers might have against a particular community. And this can be put in context of the ethnic conflict that's currently ongoing in Manipur, which is the conflict between the dominant Meitei majority and the Kuki tribal minority. And because of this context, there could have been a misunderstanding that, the party, the PDT or the PDO could have been misunderstood as either a Meitei armed group or a Kuki armed group. It's impossible to know what that misunderstanding was at the moment. But clearly there was some misalignment, some mismatch, which led to this very, very serious incident. If there was no misunderstanding and it was deliberate, then it's even more concerning. But it's hard for me to believe that the Assam Rifles or the Indian Army would deliberately open fire at a Burmese PDT or PDO, because having said everything, the forces along that border have an understanding of what the conflict on the other side is, and the fact that unless and until those forces disturb or cause any disruptions on the India side of the border, there is no reason for Indian forces to open fire at them, at a Burmese sort of resistance group. So it's a kind of a mysterious and rare kind of incident, which honestly I haven't been completely able to wrap my head around, and hence, and all of us, even Rajiv Bhattacharya in his piece wrote that an investigation is something that is urgent at this moment.
So directly on that point, what kind of accountability is there going to be, or is there usually in these situations? Are the Assam Rifles just going to march on with impunity, or will there be a token investigation or a further explanation? What do you think? There's different pressure points here to atrocities that might normally happen in Northeast India. These are foreign citizens, foreign rebels, and there's not likely to be the same level of local outrage in India, right?
Yeah. Honestly, I don't have much hopes for a fair and open investigation, because we're talking about killings by, as I said, two frontline forces, the Indian Army, Indian Army's Eastern Command, in that sense, Spear Corps, and the Assam Rifles. And going by precedent, we don't have, I personally don't have much hope that there will be an open investigation. Just for example, in 2021, the Indian Army's 21st Para Special Forces were accused of murdering 13 civilians in eastern Nagaland's Mon district, in a place called Oting. and there was massive local protests. But so far there has been no prosecution of the forces, and in fact the federal government in India denied sanction for prosecution. So every time there's an understanding that the forces operate under extraordinary circumstances, and they end up taking hasty decisions and sort of reckless operational decisions in the heat of the moment. That's why it's unfair, quote unquote, it's unfair to prosecute them. And more than that, I think the particular part of the country that we're talking about, the border that we're talking about, is kind of always under this state of exception, which is under this particular draconian law known as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, or the AFSPA, under which the forces have the legal sanction to open fire on mere suspicion that someone may be a militant or an aggressor. So within that kind of legal framework, it becomes exceedingly difficult to prosecute the forces under civil law. There may be some kind of action under martial law, but the public would never know what the exact hearing is, or what the nature of the trial has been. We might know of the final outcome, but we will never know how the trial was conducted, in what manner the trial was conducted, who were the witnesses, and what kind of testimonials were brought forward. But having said that, we are talking about a victim from a different country, a neighboring country. So there's a bit of a complication here. There's some added pressure on New Delhi at this moment to kind of conduct a fair investigation. And NUG's statement that came out last evening was pretty strong and pretty categorical in that sense, that we demand a fair investigation. But it comes down to how much importance the Indian side lays on NUG and that NUG statement, and conversely, how much clout or leverage does NUG have to pressure the Indian government to conduct this investigation. But overall, I don't have much hopes, as I said.
So yeah, thinking about that, the central Indian government, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his relations with Myanmar, thinking wider than just northeast India. Since the 28 March Sagaing earthquake, India's provided, through the Myanmar military regime, aid, help and support to victims. And Prime Minister Modi briefly met with the Myanmar coup leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, just days after the quake, last month in Bangkok. So Modi urged Min Aung Hlaing to hold inclusive and credible elections. He said there's no military solution to Myanmar's political crisis, and that enduring peace requires inclusive dialogue. That's a bit more precise language than China's important but very general support for an election of some kind this year in Myanmar. So is the Indian central government's position vis-a-vis the SAC or resistance groups changing since the earthquake, or maybe since China has come out much more fully on side with the SAC?
I don't really think there has been a fundamental shift in the position of the Indian government towards the junta. In fact, the Indian government saw the earthquake as an opportunity to engage more closely with the junta, and that's been the case with most of the regional governments. And Min Aung Hlaing also saw this as a great opportunity to sort of to leverage this opportunity to build his own diplomatic credentials in the region, right? And the fact that Min Aung Hlaing had a direct call with Prime Minister Modi and subsequently met him in Bangkok also shows that the Indian side was willing to sort of give him what he wanted in that sense, and directly engage with him. For India, the key imperative was that it wanted to sort of deepen its footprint and get deeper leverage in Naypyidaw to match up to and this is important, to match up to the Chinese leverage. Because over the last few months, we've seen China expand its relations with the junta, not least by brokering the ceasefire in the north, and most recently by supervising the handover of Lashio. So I think India was watching all of those developments carefully and wanted to sort of follow in lockstep and make sure that it has enough leverage to countervail Chinese leverage in Naypyidaw. And the earthquake was a great opportunity in that sense. I would be surprised if India doesn't at least notionally support the sham elections that are coming up in December. India might say that we need to engage with all kinds of stakeholders, this, that. But in my view, these are all kind of standard boilerplate language that India has been saying. But having said that, one big change that has happened, not even recently, it happened after Operation 1027, which is that India started to seriously engage behind closed doors with the resistance groups, especially the groups in Western Myanmar, most prominently the CNF, the Chilean Brotherhood, members of the Chilean Brotherhood, and Arakan Army, of course. So in that sense, I think India has realized that it's futile to engage with the junta as far as Western Myanmar is concerned, because junta is simply incapable of not just holding on to territory, but reclaiming the lost territory from these groups. So it's better to engage with these groups who are in actual, genuine control, effective control of the regions along the border. So that is one big strategic shift that happened, in my view, of India kind of opening up to the idea of seriously and genuinely engaging and having conversations with these groups. You talked about the earthquake aid, right? So, of course, the most amount of the largest tranche of the aid went through Nepido, I mean, rather Yangon, or the SAC. But there was also one small development where India sent aid to Sagaing via the land border in Chin State in coordination with the Chin CNF. So, and the CNF, and there was a news report regarding this, the CNF reportedly coordinated the transfer of aid to Sagaing. So, here is one instance where India was sending aid through non-SSC channels in direct coordination of an anti-SSC EAO. So, there are these interesting contradictions in that policy. So, in India is trying to be nimble in its diplomacy, but I don't think India has a kind of strategic depth and connections that China at the moment has to play both sides. And that's simply because India did not committedly invest in building those relations in the last few years that China did. So we would never see something of the Indian equivalent of a Chinese supervised handover of a major city in Myanmar. I mean, in that sense, Lashio becomes that metaphor of the difference between the leverage that China and India enjoys, the differential leverage. Yeah.
Well, there's one Myanmar issue that India could really help with. That's, of course, the plight of the Rohingya, with around 1 million stateless refugees stuck in Bangladesh. And there are plenty of Rohingya in India also, many of them registered with the UN Refugee Agency. But India seems to want nothing to do with the Rohingya. Even worse, just a week ago, there was an awful event. Bear with me for a second as I describe it for the listeners. I think you're familiar with it. So authorities in New Delhi summoned 43 Rohingya refugees that are registered with the UN on the pretense of collecting their biometric data. Of course, the government of India uses facial recognition and fingerprints extensively in its systems. But these Rohingya were instead detained and then deported to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, put on a boat and piloted to the Myanmar southern coast. They were then pushed into the ocean with life jackets and forced to swim and wade to the shore. They landed in Hlaingtharya township, which is a conflict zone, where they were found by members of a resistance group fighting the Myanmar military, who are apparently still taking care of them. This is a crazy story, Angshuman, that the interim government in Bangladesh seems to be opening itself to more influence from the US and even China on the Rohingya issue. And India just seems to want nothing to do with it and now is, deporting refugees in this quite over-the-top way. Why is India taking such a hard stance on these desperate people?
So there are a mix of a couple of factors here, which is number one, is the attitude of the current Modi government towards Muslim minorities, right? And here we need to call a spade, which is that for the Hindutva political class, the Rohingya have been one of the primary sort of enemies, internal enemies or external enemies in the neighborhood, cultural enemies and threats. And the way they are framed is threats to India's internal security. So this is kind of cultural chauvinism and xenophobia at its worst. Framed by this larger idea of expelling all undesirables from what is supposed to be a homogeneous Hindu state or Hindu nation in that sense, Hindu Rashtra. So, and the Rohingya absolutely do not have any place in that Hindu Rashtra. They are probably the first among all unequals in that sense, followed by, you could say, undocumented migrants from Bangladesh. So Bengali speaking Muslims and anyone who speaks a language which is close to Bengali, for example, Rohingya, and our Muslim refugees are seen as grave threats to the body politic and to the society, Hindu society. This is the broader sort of cultural ideological context that we have to keep in mind when we try to make sense of this. Secondly, on the diplomatic front, which is that even under the Sheikh Hasina government, which was kind of pro-India, India was extremely passive on the Rohingya issue, and it refused to do much to help Dhaka deal with the issue, despite repeated requests from Dhaka to do so. In fact, in 2017, when the genocide happened, and after that, 1 month after the genocide started, Modi went to Myanmar and met Aung San Suu Kyi, and in that he ended up calling calling that attack, the whole violence, as a terrorist attack, and without addressing the other side of it, which was the clearance operations, genocidal clearance operations from the Myanmar army side. And Dhaka was really unhappy with that. And just a few days later, India's foreign ministry had to release a statement which was more balanced. So for the longest time, Dhaka had this sort of grudge against India that Delhi is not doing enough to help Bangladesh, deal with this problem. The only thing that India did, the limited thing, was give some kind of humanitarian aid to Myanmar to help, to sort of rehabilitate the Rohingya refugees in Rakhine, and the internally displaced IDPs, Rohingya IDPs in Rakhine. But they did so through what was known as the RSDP, Rohingya State Development Program, which was a pretty much of a complete dud, and did not help the Rohingya at all. And I think India also extended prefabricated houses, gave prefabricated houses to Myanmar to resettle the Rohingya, which I think, in my view, in my knowledge, remains completely unused so far. So India had a great opportunity to even kind of mediate a repatriation agreement between Bangladesh, a very constructive and pro-refugee repatriation agreement between Bangladesh and Myanmar, but it failed to do so. And this essentially created space for China to step in and do what India could have done, right? And now, after last year, after the fall of the Sheikh Hasina government and coming of the Yunus administration, things have completely turned around for India, right? Which is that India doesn't have any more favors left in Dhaka, and this administration is not friendly towards India. So that the opportunity that India missed is farther off in the horizon right now. And I think India has lost that opportunity, completely missed that bus, in my view. And I don't think the Yunus administration would even entertain any Indian role in the Rohingya crisis at the moment. And these forced deportations that we are seeing, these horrendous reports of forced abandonment of Rohingya refugees at sea, which is a new low even by the current standards of anti-humanitarianism that the Indian government has shown of late, is being noticed in Bangladesh, right? Not just that, India has also pushed back hundreds of undocumented migrants and Rohingya refugees across the land border into Bangladesh over the last few weeks. And the Bangladeshi government has vocally complained about that, saying that this is unacceptable. So India has made a 180 degree turn from a space where it had an opportunity to intervene and make a constructive sort of effort to resolve this regional problem. And now we are basically ending up, further provoking Bangladesh on that front. So I think things have turned for the worse.
Yeah, it's awful. But I guess it just focuses more eyes on Bangladesh, I suppose. Now, before saying goodbye, I want to, I introduced you as a PhD student, so I want to finish just by asking you quickly what your thesis is about, because, I'm sure it'll become a book that we'll all be reading in a couple of years' time.
My specific project is essentially trying to understand the nexus between security and economy along the India-Myanmar and the Thai-Myanmar borders. And my specific case studies are the Mizoram-Chin border and the Mesa-Mayawadi border. With specific on the Assam-Mayawadi border, essentially Shui Cocoa and the whole sort of illicit economy, cross-border illicit economy nexus. And on this side, trying to understand what security means to the people on the ground on both sides of the border, and how that matches up with Delhi's vision of security.
That sounds fascinating. Great stuff. I'm sure that it's involved some very interesting fieldwork as well. So let me say thanks again, Angshuman, and I look forward to welcoming you back onto the show, maybe next time as a doctor.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting.
Now, a quick plug. Listeners, if you're not a Frontier Myanmar member, it's never too late to join. Frontier really does lead the way in publishing features and providing daily newsletters, translations, media monitoring from print, online, and social media sources. And let's not forget the fortnightly political insider analyses. What's happening in Myanmar? Plenty, but Frontier can't cover it all without your support. If you're already a member, thank you for keeping the spotlight on Myanmar and helping Frontier's hardworking journalists do what they do. That brings us to the end of the show. Please get in touch with your feedback. We love it. Just email whimyanmar@proton.me. And thanks for keeping up for another week with what's happening in Myanmar. Until next week, farewell and take care.